Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here for Gunnerkrigg Court Chapter 68, Neither.
Hi there.
So again, this chapter picks up where the last one left off, and Annie has just entered the forest after Jones has been separated from her, and she's off to meet whatever has become of Sengren and Coyote. And it looks like that whatever it is isn't even going to talk to Annie until she looks through the ether, and as soon as she does, he bursts onto the scene and introduces himself. And the name that he's chosen for himself is Lou, or Loop, and I guess we'll probably go back and forth between those two pronunciations. It's actually a French word for wolf, and the reason that I chose that is because coyote is a coyote and renard is a fox, and renard is French for a fox. And so this creature felt that it was appropriate to call himself a wolf, or just Lou in this sense.
And he chose French because Sengren is from a French story, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so in the way that coyote is like the embodiment of all coyotes and renard is the embodiment of all foxes, he's declared now that Lou is the embodiment of all wolves.
Although he's not very wolf-like in behavior, is he?
He's not. No, and that kind of goes hand in hand with Coyote not really being very, well, he doesn't even look like a coyote, you know. But straight from the start we see that Lou is a mixture of the two creatures, and he is very coyote-like but not quite like Coyote, and I wanted to make sure that his personality was kind of different to Coyote's. The more that we learn about him, the more that we realize he's not really like Coyote or Sengren. It's
interesting that it kind of seems like he's ended up with the worst aspects of both their personalities rather than the best.
Yeah, that's kind of something that we'll get into as we hear him talk and as Annie converses with him. And the first thing that Lou does get into talking about is exactly why Sengren did kill Coyote, despite him having said to Annie in the past that he loved him very deeply. And this is the sort of weird logic that Sengren has built up for himself that mainly comes down to feeling that the concept of Coyote is kind of what he was obsessed with, perhaps not even Coyote as an individual himself. And he felt that Coyote, the individual, was not really living up to Coyote the concept, and that if he was basically in control of the power that Coyote had, then he would be able to personify what Coyote was meant to be better than Coyote the individual could, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes me wonder, like, if Coyote is a creature that is born of the dreams of man, basically, can Sengren also influence that with his own dreams of Coyote, or is it just more directly like he's done here by killing him?
No, it's a very direct thing. Coyote has mentioned in the past that he and all the etheric creatures only really exist because of the collective consciousness of humans, and Sengren not only kind of despises that idea, but is aware that he is completely separate from that. So even as just one person, his dreams wouldn't be enough to affect anything, but he's not even part of like this group that would contribute to what is, I guess, Coyote's power. He's not a human, so he wouldn't be part of any of that. But here we kind of get a look at some of the contradictory nature of Coyote's power that I really like to focus on in here and in the side story that I did of Coyote, and in many places where I talk specifically about Coyote's power. I like to show that Coyote is strong enough to exist past contradictions, I guess. And so for example, Lou is saying here that Coyote loved stories of himself so much that he liked to hear them for the first time over and over again, which is kind of a weird contradictory power, or kind of a weird use of like a very strong power that you might have. But this kind of thinking leads to why this whole situation has come about, and it turns out that Coyote was very interested in the concept of dying, I guess, and he's set up this situation where he himself would die at the hands of this new creature.
I always thought this page was really memorable, especially because even now Coyote's death is kind of a question mark in some ways, just because it's hard to imagine how a creature like Coyote could die. So to hear him talk about how Coyote wanted to die and wanted to experience that, it just kind of raises even more questions about Coyote's true nature. I also want to say that whenever we see Renard kind of from Sengren's point of view, it always makes me dislike Renard a little bit, just because Coyote always favors him and compliments him, even though Sengren is the one who loves Coyote so much.
Yeah, that's very much always been the dynamic between the three of them. So we've always seen that Coyote was always trying to give gifts to Renard, even though he didn't ever want them, because he would have wanted Renard to be the one to give Coyote the experience of death and then become a new creature. But because this unexpected element of Annie comes along and in a way catches Sengren's eye, Coyote found that very interesting and then decided to change his focus to that instead.
If Annie had to choose between Renard or Sengren, which would she choose?
Depends what you mean by choose.
Like, I don't know, if she had to choose one to live and one to die, God forbid.
Well, who do you like better, your mom or your dad?
It's kind of cute to think of Sengren and Renard as Annie's mom and dad.
Or parental figures.
Point taken.
So they're both very different and they have different roles to her. So I don't know if she could ever make that decision.
Well, I'm glad the answer isn't just Renard full stop, because I love that she loves Isengrin too.
Yeah, no, she loves them both. And that's why she was kind of distraught here at the thought of maybe Isengrin being kind to her was a manipulation by Coyote. And I wanted to make sure that the readers and Annie knew that that is not the case, that all the affection that Isengrin has shown Annie in his own way was through his own volition.
I was glad to see that too.
But on the next page, we start to get the indication that Lugh is actually very different to Isengrin and Coyote. He starts off by making these strange requests and weird leaps of logic that are kind of putting Annie on the back foot and making her kind of defensive. And she, like the readers, are starting to realize that he is kind of off. And he starts to make these weird threats and demands. And now, Coyote in the past has also made his own threats and demands, but I wanted them to seem very different to Coyote in the past. Coyote's always been very dangerous, obviously, but a lot more playful, and Annie kind of came to understand that the way Coyote was acting was not really what he was feeling, and he would very quickly switch back and forth between being threatening or being playful. But Lugh here is kind of consistent all the way in his personality so far, where he is likely to make a strange demand and then back it up with a threat, but then not sort of call back off that. And this is something that Annie is kind of starting to realize here.
When he makes himself appear human here at the end of the page, kind of suggesting to Annie if she lived in the forest she would have companions and stuff, it's kind of similar to the way Coyote would pretend to be that elf boy, but in a much more kind of sinister, creepy way than Coyote ever did it.
Yeah, that's right. When Coyote was doing it, he was doing it for a laugh, whereas Lugh here is kind of giving that example that he could make himself look human and stuff, doing that directly after saying that he loves Annie and that he wants her to stay here. And so it's supposed to be a lot creepier and weird, whereas Coyote was able to come across as just kind of having a laugh, and making a joke. In the instance that you're talking about when he became Jolly Elfsbury, it was actually just a joke at Eglamour's expense, not at Annie's. But he's also making these demands and threats, really, and then offering things to Annie to try and make her change her mind and stuff. And it's supposed to come across as kind of a little desperate. But Annie uses this opportunity to kind of engineer a situation where she can then talk to Isengrin. And then we get a little view of Isengrin's side of the situation.
So this means that Isengrin is alive in there somewhere?
Not really. Only in the sense that Coyote is dead but still a part of Lugh. Isengrin is also dead but also a part of Lugh. And so Annie is kind of drawing on that contradictory power and making the request that if Lugh is so powerful, then he can section off this part of himself that is Isengrin and then allow him to talk to Annie as if he were still alive,
Yeah.
And this is not something that is beyond Coyote's power, and by that measure Lugh's power, so that's why she's able to talk to Isengrin here. But Lugh doesn't actually let that go on for very long.
Well, I thought that was interesting too, because like you said, it shows that Lugh has a kind of desperation to him. It doesn't seem like Coyote worried too much about letting things slip because he knew he was always in control. But it seems like you shouldn't hear Lugh is a little bit more concerned about that kind of thing.
Yeah, and when he does let Isengrin speak, we see that he lets slip that Lugh's actually lost control of the forest in some way. And he talks about how when Coyote was alive, he sort of set up some weird system that kept the forest running, I guess, that kept the forest and the ether integrated in a particular way that was very unique to Coyote. But now that Coyote is dead and Lugh, this new creature, has come along, that's somehow started to unravel.
So before Coyote came to the forest, was the forest just a forest?
Yeah, it was a regular magical forest, that had talking creatures, and the ether existed back then. But here we see that when Coyote has arrived, he has done something to the forest to make it something more than that, and he's sort of integrated himself very finely into the forest. Almost like, I guess you'd call it a dead man's switch, where if Coyote is suddenly removed, then that's going to throw the entire forest into disarray.
Uh-huh.
But for now, instead of dealing with the problems that has happened, Lugh has just halted time in the forest completely, so it doesn't have to deal with it just yet.
Is the elf town we see there the same place that Annie visited in Annie in the Forest?
Yeah, it is. It's the main street from Annie in the Forest.
You mentioned in a previous video also when Lugh first arrived that you wanted Lugh to have some of the stretching powers of Coyote, the changing powers of him, but not quite be as elastic. Were there certain limits you put on yourself when drawing him?
Yeah, Lugh can bend around and stretch himself around and change the shape of his body and do a lot of the same stuff that Coyote does, but I chose to make the instances where Lugh Lube does this, kind of restricted. So I guess the way I see it in my mind is that he doesn't turn himself into symbolic representations of himself as literally as Coyote used to. And I would represent that in the comic by changing the art styles every once in a while, by, say, turning Coyote into a cartoon version of himself, or turning Coyote into just like symbolic representations, I guess, and keeping him very fluid. But Lou doesn't really do that. He always kind of looks the same, but he does still change his aspect sometimes, you know. So his nose will get bigger, or his teeth will get giant, or he'll have these weird sort of claw hands instead of paws, like a wolf would, but he still looks very much like Lou. He's not quite as fluid as Coyote was. But after we see what's happened with the forest, this is when Lou continues to make some strange demands. And this calls back to what I was saying earlier about how Coyote would do things like removing his memories. And so we see that the goose bone and the lake water that Coyote gave to Harley and Smitty a while back might actually contain some memories. At least the goose bone, anyway. And because so far threats haven't really worked against Annie, I guess because she's kind of used to Coyote, Lou sort of changes his tack and instead offers to get rid of the psychopomps instead. But in doing that, he kind of goes a little bit too far and insults Sengren one too many times.
Although, when I was rereading this chapter, preparing for this video, I did notice that Annie didn't outwardly say no to Lou's offer to free her from the psychopomps in exchange for the returned items.
No, that's right. Instead, she decided to call him out on him basically being mean about a friend of hers. And we get another glimpse of the fiery side of Annie, which Lou's just able to shrug off easily. But we do get some defense of Sengren from Annie, and defense of humans, really, and this kind of leads to Lou bringing up the fact that even the very stories that Sengren was part of were sort of constructed in a way that were very negative against Sengren.
So, this is the first time in Gunnerkrigg Court that the stories of Sengren and Renard are deliberately brought up, right?
Yeah.
So was it hard to wait this long to mention them?
Oh, no, not really, because I think people were pretty up to speed, I guess. I never really outright mentioned that Renard and Sengren are from the stories of Renard, but there was enough of a hint there that back when the characters were being introduced and the themes were being revealed in the story, there was enough there for people to go off and then research and learn about the stories of Sengren and Renard. And that was something that I wanted the audience to do if they felt like it, but didn't make it so that was necessary reading. And I think a lot of the audience at this point kind of already knew that this is where Sengren and Renard came from, so I didn't feel that it was a big reveal or a big element that I felt was super important to the story, but here it was important to show that, well, this entire time the characters of Sengren and Renard have had their own backstory, and despite what we the readers and Annie have come to learn about Sengren and Renard and their development in Gunnerkrigg Court, the story, there is this past history that they're drawing on. And unfortunately for Sengren, his past history was that of a buffoon, really, you know.
Well, when you were coming up with the character of Sengren for the story, was it that you felt bad for him from the old stories? Because it's pretty cruel to him.
It's not that I felt super bad for the character of Sengren in the stories, because, you know, he's not meant to be made felt bad for, if that makes sense. But what I did find interesting was imagining if you were to meet a person who was just created in these stories, you know, and they were given something more than what the original writer had intended for their personality. So Sengren and Renard really are people that Annie has come to talk to and understand and learn their motivations and come to see as real people. And I felt it would be an interesting situation if you were to meet a fictional character outside of the fiction that they were created in.
The other thing that's a little sad to me about this page is Annie mentions that her mother used to read her these stories, and if that were true, it would have been after she had Annie and left the court, which means it would have been after she actually met Sengren, and it kind of doesn't say much about what Surma thought of Sengren.
Yeah, and up till now there's not really been much mention of the relationship that Sengren and Surma had, and that really is just because she didn't really think very much of him, you know. It wasn't until Annie came along that Sengren really kind of got any attention, you know. He was just the brute and the angry guy that hang around with Coyote, and that's how everybody treated him at the beginning of the story, even Renard really, and the rest of the court. And everybody's always been kind of bewildered at the shine that Sengren and Annie have taken to each other, and kind of questioning why they're even friends. But Annie has seen a side of Sengren that pretty much nobody else has, especially people who may have only read the stories of Sengren and Renard, you know. You're not supposed to read those stories and feel that there is any more depth to the character of Sengren. But here, where this fictional character has essentially come to life in the forest and Annie's been able to talk to him, she has understood that he has a lot more to his personality, and further than that, they've actually grown close because of it. And she places a great deal of value on the relationship that they've fostered over the years that they've known each other. And of course, saying that this does not now extend to Lou, because he just not only is a whole new creature, but does not act like his Sengren in the same way. So he shouldn't be expecting to cash in on the goodwill that she and his Sengren have created with each other, and even with Sengren and Coyote. And she says outright that it's funny how he is a combination of two creatures that she loved and enjoyed spending time with, and yet he's still so lacking in personality. And this brings the whole scene of them conversing in the ether to a close, and Annie starts to leave the forest, because she's pretty much accomplished what she came here for in getting Lou to promise that he wouldn't continue his attack on the court. But because Lou is a huge jerk, apparently, he sets up all these caveats in place where he's not responsible now for anything that happens, but there is still a lot of danger coming to the court, and it will be in Annie's best interest to make good on the demands that he's set.
And I remember that readers had noticed Annie's hair getting gradually a little bit longer and longer as this chapter went on, and here in this page, she points it out, which must have been kind of satisfying, since I know readers were like, is this a mistake in the drawing and stuff?
Yeah, right from the very first page of the chapter, time has been manipulated by Lou, not completely under his control, but he says that several months have passed, and we learn that it's actually 6 months have gone by. And I hid the fact that Annie's hair was growing because people are already used to the fact that Annie's hair looks a lot longer in the ether. And so in the previous pages where she was turning into her fire form and letting her hair go loose because she burned away the band that was keeping her hair together, the fact that her hair was growing over time was obscured, but yeah, as soon as she came out of the ether and her hair was halfway down her back, some people did point it out and thought that I had accidentally drawn her hair incorrectly, but it was just something I'd been planning all along, I'm afraid. Though it does also mean that Jones was up in orbit for the past 6 months. And upon remembering that, Lou does send her back down to the court. And as an afterthought, he closes the ravine entirely and gets rid of the island waters. One of the longest running symbols of the entire comic so far is just gone.
That's so sad.
Well, that's kind of one of the things about his personality, is that he is messing things up, and that is what Annie is saying here in the end, saying that, look, with everything that Sengren and Coyote had, the one thing that you didn't retain was their limits, and he is doing things because it pleases him, but not in the way that Coyote would. And now Annie goes back into the court and has to deal with all the consequences. And that is where this chapter ends, and actually it's also where the book ends. And this collection of chapters makes up Volume 7, Synthesis. And as usual, because it's the end of a book, I do another treatise page which summarizes everything that's been going on and also drops hints for stuff to come in the future.
Can I ask any questions about it, or would you rather leave it to
No, sure,
readers?
you can ask questions. I'm just not going to give everything away because I like to leave some stuff for the readers to think about.
Well, the first thing I noticed was the bind on Annie's hand. Is there a reason why it's back here in this picture?
Well, yes, and it is similar to the reason why Kat also has a bind on her wrist. That's about as much as I'd like to say.
Interesting.
But I guess in general, this composition was made to be seen from either way up, and I thought it would be interesting to have Kat as the main focus of this one. But in print, it's much easier to see from the other way around. It's one of the pains of having to view things on the monitor. It's very difficult to actually see it from upside down. Although, of course, that's not something that you normally need to be able to do in illustration, but this was specifically designed that way.
Well, it's one of my favorites of the treatises.
Yeah, and just a few of the elements here. This is the second time Kat is depicted with the peacock's feather. And in alchemy, that depicts the stage of taking a material that you're refining through the various color changes and the various stages of refinement. And this is because this is what Kat has been doing the entire time. And we see that the other elements that are part of her waist adornment here are not only the golem heart in her hand and the arrow that Diego had made, but also this symbol here of the broken man here, who is Tony, who she's working with. And a pretty obvious element in the background is Juliet and Arthur climbing this ladder away from this red planet, which I imagine is the court, the base that they start on, and they're heading off up towards Annie's realm into the realm of the ether as they escape the court. And coming in from the side of the image here is a bony finger, which is the psychopomps starting to edge their way more directly into Annie's life. But that also leaves plenty of other stuff unexplained that people can ponder about. And that's one of my favourite parts of doing the treatise pages. I like them as singular illustrations on their own, but I do also like that it's something I can just spend some time on and looking back over the course of the comic and trying to do a treatise page that I am more happy with than the previous ones and trying to think of new compositions and stuff. And I do actually quite like this one too. But with that is the end of the chapter, and come back again for chapter 69, Loop's Trick.
Bye!